The
quorum is 4, so that's 3 plus 1. So let's call this meeting to order. I think I've already done so, and I've already invited the administration in. I think that in the other room, the PAC meeting is still ongoing, and other meetings as well.
Apology bill 嚇，係要學識點樣道歉我哋。好，請政府同事坐定定。
So, would the administration representatives please take a seat?
好，各位咁。
Members, at the last meeting, the subcommittee already completed the clause-by-clause scrutiny of the Product Eco-responsibility Regulation, and we need to deal with some outstanding issues arising from the last meeting, namely some draft CSAs to be moved by the administration, and Mr. Ted Hui will also be moving an amendment. So perhaps let me invite the administration to brief us on the written response to the matters arising from the last meeting and also the draft CSAs. The legal advisor will also be putting some questions to you. So, Deputy Director, over to you. Thank you, Chairman. Now, in relation to today's paper, we'd like to explain to the subcommittee the changes that we will be making as we mentioned in previous meetings. In paragraph 2, in relation to the distribution of recycling labels, our members' views were that the phrase "to avoid doubt" may cause doubts that the government doesn't encourage labels to be affixed onto the REE, and that is why we propose to delete the phrase "to avoid doubt," and we will also make it clear that the supplier and the seller may affix a label onto the REE, or at least to provide it. And by this expression, we wish to make it clear that the government encourages fixing the label onto the item. And earlier, as we explained, that if we compel the industry to stick the label onto the equipment, it may increase the burden of the industry and may cost more in terms of compliance costs. The objective is to remind the consumers of the recycling levy, and through other channels we can make known to the consumer that the levy has been collected. For example, we can require the seller to make it clear on the receipt. So there are other channels to inform the consumers. And we also focus on publicity and public education so that consumers may be aware of the recycling levy level and their right to obtain removal service plan. And in paragraph 4, in relation to the removal service plan, regarding the number of collectors, the original proposal was 3 collectors, but we have heard views from the trade and they would like to have more flexibility, and we therefore are going to raise the maximum number to 5 collectors. And also, in the event that the collectors are unable to provide a service, the seller can provide this removal service. We hope that the amendments can reflect this objective. Also, on the deadline for making a request for removal service, in the past, the original phrase was before the expiry of 3 days, and members would like to advance the period so that the consumer can make this request earlier, and that is why we are going to propose a change, and that the starting date would be within 3 days after the consumer has bought this REE, and the consumer has to decide whether to request for removal service. I think these are the major changes, Chairman. Thank you. Members, on this follow-up written response and the draft CSAs proposed by the administration, we welcome questions from members. The speaking time limit will be 4 minutes as usual. Who would like to ask questions, please? Now, to facilitate our discussion and to save time, I'd like Mr. Ted Ho to explain his proposed amendment as well, because it is related. The administration is going to move an amendment in relation to the label. And earlier, we raised concerns about the drafting of that provision. I understand that through this amendment, our concern has been addressed, and that we will not have this perception that the government is discouraging the sticking of label onto the equipment. But like the administration explained, this will not be made a mandatory requirement, because the supplier or the seller can stick the label onto the REE or provide the label by other means. That is to say, to hand over this label to the consumer who buys that piece of equipment at the time of purchase. That is just one example. Mr. Ted Ho has proposed an amendment to make this requirement mandatory. I'd like to first ask the Secretariat whether my proposed amendment is available for perusal by every member. Yes? Well, I understand from the administration's CSA that the wording is now different. They do encourage the supplier to affix the label onto the equipment. But again, there is the expression or otherwise. In short, it's up to the supplier to decide whether to just provide the label or to affix it. And I think that's a legal requirement. But in practice, definitely the supplier will opt for a way to achieve this purpose at the lowest cost and the greatest efficiency, which means that they will not affix the label onto the equipment. So although the wording may have been changed, that you encourage them to affix it to the equipment, in practice this will not take place. I don't think that it has any real meaning. If it doesn't bring about real change, and that's my view, I prefer my version. I believe that for Section 9, you should make it a mandatory requirement that the supplier affixes the label to the equipment. Now, I'd like to respond to the point about public education to raise the consumers' awareness of the recycling levy. Second point, from the consumer's perspective, more information can be provided to consumers. Well, first of all, very likely the cost will be transferred onto consumers so that they need to understand why the price is now higher. And if a consumer decides to buy an equipment from overseas or through the internet, then there will be different treatment, namely no removal service available. And like Deputy Director has told the media, some cunning suppliers or sellers will not be able to play tricks. Well, because the recycling levy will be collected by the government, and the consumer should understand what REEs would be subject to the levy. So I believe that under Section 9, you should require the supplier or seller to affix the label to the equipment. And also for Section 27, I don't think that a mandatory requirement should be imposed, because at the supply level, the labels should have been affixed to the equipment. Legal advisor. I'd like to invite the Deputy Director to respond first, but the legal advisor would like to add her comments as well. In relation to Mr. Ted Hoi's suggestion, we already explained our views in previous meetings, and as I mentioned in the opening remarks in paragraph 3 of the paper, we also responded to his suggestion. We agree strongly that public education and publicity is important, but we don't find it necessary to compel the supplier to affix a label to the equipment. Legal advisor. Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to confirm with Mr. Ted Hui and also to explain to other members the implication of Mr. Ted Hui's amendment. As you can see, Mr. Hui has proposed 2 amendments. Namely, the word "not" is deleted in 9.3 such that the label is required to be affixed onto the equipment. And correspondingly, for section 27.3, which provides that the seller should or should not affix the recycling label provided to a consumer, this is deleted, and we can refer to section 35 subsection 2 and also subsection 1. These 2 should be read together, because in the principal legislation, the registered supplier and the seller have their respective legal responsibilities. To provide the recycling label to the person in receipt of the regulated electrical equipment, or REE. So, if Mr. Ted Hui proposes this change, we need to consider first of all whether the seller has to, say, unwrap the packaging to confirm that the registered supplier has affixed a label to the equipment. And if Mr. Hui would like the seller to take up this responsibility, first of all, I don't see this being mentioned in the amendment, and also in the principal legislation, there is no mentioning of this responsibility of the seller to ensure whether the label has been affixed or not. And also for the section 35(2)(a), you can say whether or not the supplier has affixed a label to the equipment or not. The seller can provide a recycling label to the consumer anyway, so that he would not be in contravention of section 32(2)(a). Otherwise, according to section 35, he is deemed to have committed an offense and will be liable to a fine of level 5. So we need to make clear the legal effect of Mr. Hui's amendment. If you require the supplier to affix the label to the REE, then the supplier may be meeting the requirement of providing the recycling label, but the seller is also required to provide a recycling label to the consumer. So I'd like to hear from Mr. Hui how this should be done by the seller. Let's say, should the seller provide a recycling label to the consumer anyway, or should he, say, unwrap the packaging to confirm whether the label has been affixed? Thank you, legal advisor, for the question. Like you said, in the bill, the seller is required to provide a recycling label. That's how it is worded. But in section 9, if the registered supplier has affixed a recycling label onto the equipment, then at the retail level, it is understood that the seller or the REE must have come with a label, unless the REE is obtained through smuggling or other illegal means. So I think at that level, a seller can be reassured. Well, please just let me finish. And then the seller can also adopt an administrative measure to monitor the source of REE from the supplier, to check reasonably whether the label has been affixed. Well, it may not be necessary for the seller to open the box every time when it is delivered. At another level, when a consumer buys a piece of equipment from a store, then usually the consumer will ask for the box to be opened, or for, say, the power cord to be plugged in to see if it works. And also for larger equipment such as washing machine or an air conditioner, basically after it is delivered to the consumer's home, it will be installed as well. And in practice, we don't need the seller to deliberately open the box to check it. And that's the purpose of my amendment.
I understand, and all members would also understand that I will not comment on the advantages or disadvantages of the amendment. And in terms of the legal implications, I have to be very clear to you, because not because or just solely to rely on the supplier in under 99% of the circumstances to have already met the requirements. Because under the principal legislation, as is currently, the reseller, in the event of failing to provide an REE recycling label to the consumer, that would mean that they have broke the law. They would not have any basis to see that whether the supplier had done it or not, or do we have any, how to estimate reasonable reliance to trust him. There's no such thing in such the principal legislation. So simply put, the legal implication would be whether the supplier had it or not, the reseller had the independent responsibility to provide such labels to the consumers. And if the supplier had provided them and been checked and inspected, and it would just hand it over to the consumer. And if the supplier had not such labels, it also had the own obligation to provide the recycling labels to the consumers. This obligation is independent whether the supplier had provided them. Just very quickly, I'd just like to ask the legal advisor, are you talking about the straight liability offense by the reseller? I think that in practice, we have such an amendment. A reseller could use administrative measures. Let's say you could have a sign an agreement with the supplier that must affix the labels for the goods. So does that mean to resolve an obligation question? Whether it was a strict liability offense or an absolute liability offense depends on a variety of factors, and the Court of Fine Appeal actually have visited those kind of cases. And we look at the wording of the regulation. It's spelled very clearly that the reseller responsibility is independent of that of the supplier. And as a reseller, I have to make sure that I would not violate the Section 35(2)(a), and thus I'll be subject to a penalty. What I would do, I would be to provide a recycling label to a consumer. I can give it to consumer in two ways. First, I wouldn't care whether the supplier had provided or not. I just give them one anyway. Or I confirm that whether the supplier had given the label before giving it to him. So here I have to be clear about the legal implications, because Mr. Hoy's proposed amendment had not mentioned or to explain in the reseller had the responsibility to open the boxes to make sure the labels are affixed. And just it, and I just speaking purely from the legal implication point of view, or from the policy level, or whether there will be administrative measures to check with the supplier as we're talking about a private arrangements. Just would like to make it clear. I would like to ask Mr. Hui, as for your amendment, would you like to propose yourself or propose by the committee? So even if you're not asked to be promoted to the committee, this is still meaningful discussion. I'm sure the other members would like to understand the implications and legally and what is the impact, even if you proposed it in the future council meeting. The members will be free to make up their own minds. So just want to ask you going to propose it personally, unless the members agree to take proposal at the committee level, because I heard other views from the members. I don't remember Mr. Charles Kwok, especially those computer trade that affects the label will create difficulties. You like to move the amendment yourself. The members will not able to vote down your amendment, and you also have time to amend your wording. And the next would be Mr. Xu, and followed by Mr. Chan Hao-kan, so 4 minutes each. Mr. Hui, I understand, I hope that the public would not be deceived or whether which REE will be under-regulated or which one isn't. I believe that when they are implemented, I believe that the receipts would have spelled it very clearly that besides the type of goods, there's a separate item that explain that this levy had already been charged. And if the resellers or the suppliers or the shops, and if the receipt spelled in clearly and white, that and there'll be trouble that if not, because there'll be amount of deception. First point made. And in terms of public education, more could be done to make the public aware that talk about 5 pieces of electrical goods, which not be difficult to understand. And during the process, you might know, and when the suppliers of labels, there are currently some energy labels on the white goods on the fridge, etc. And if they add too many labels, the fact that it will be in doubt. And on the manufacturers, on the suppliers level, in terms of facilitating their business, would that be creating challenges for them? And just like Eco-Advisor had raised, on the level of the reseller in the future, because they will be shouldering responsibility independently, and if the box do not have the labels, would they have to change the supplier or be subject to legal action? And in the event of such scenarios, that will actually make the whole process complicated. I hope the members will need to consider carefully whether there is such need to do so. And on the other hand, for the public education, the department could do more work that still just worried about the public would not understand. Once we all were informed of this, this unnecessary gesture could be reduced. Mr. Chan. I'm sure that Mr. Hui's intention is correct, and also thanks to the legal advice on the implication of the legal liability between the reseller and the supplier. And I recall earlier in the meeting I have discussed examples. For example, the energy saving efficiency labels, because I have a sketchy recollection of it. I hope the administration representative could help. And for these labels, was it affixed at the time of manufacturing? And once they have been affixed, and just like Mr. Hui has said, it would have been affixed alongside with the energy saving labels, would it involve the same procedures? The supplier, when if they're missing either of the labels, would they give rise to obligations as stated by the legal advisor? The most basic question would be, affects the energy, is that a risk? Is it have a legal responsibility to affix the energy saving labels? I think there's some sort of confusion, but I see there's some similarity. But why? So why we can do that to the energy saving labels, but are not able to do so on the levy label? I think this is a good question, because from my understanding, the situations are different. Simply put, if the batch of goods is ordered to Hong Kong, they would for the recycling levy, there is a complicated process that involves a levy, which is quite different. So let's have the deputy director or Mr. Lai to explain the difference between the two. So why this recycling levy label would be difficult to have the mandatory affixed it. Chairman, maybe I would explain from the point of the functions. For example, in terms of the operation, whether it would have the issues related to on the part of the supplier or reseller, I would have to calculate this later. I would introduce in the early meetings necessary and enhancing their efficiency. Had to have an inspection to ensure that to note about the inefficiency, and before to affix the energy labels on the appliances. So when consumers in shopping for the electric appliances, they will have extra information in helping to make their choice. In our scenario, in terms of the purpose, whether it is necessary, we have different views. Well, mainly because Mr. Yu has said whether these appliances with televisions, big or small set, on different models or different features, or levy is applied all across. Therefore, the consumers will not need to know from the levy whether levy would have to be paid. So as long as we're selling this electrical goods, they know a levy would be applied. And of course, there are also some carry out other information that would make clearer. And further, we think that the receipt that should be issued would already let the consumer aware that the levy had already been charged. And the difference between that of the levy when it makes decision, therefore, would not have any extra information is required to see whether a levy has been paid, regardless of the model number. So the levy would have been changed. So there's a difference of the two schemes. And for the actual operations, whether on the production chain or the chain, whether we apple for apples comparison for the energy labels. For example, for the energy labels, it's not mandatory to be affixed by the manufacturer. There are probably less layer involved, and whether it's mandatory to affix the label, we have discussed with the trade. One of the key reason and the key difference with that currently we have, besides the cover the usual energy efficiency labels, computers is also being covered for the levy and for the label to be displayed. And currently, the distribution, especially the arrangements of the computers, will not be easily achievable. So, is there anything to compliment Mr. Lai? There are a few key points which you mentioned that the energy labels that for the goods covered, especially for computers, and it was currently excluded from the energy labels. And this computer trade, and that there is the difficulty in the operations. For example, on some of the electrical equipment, in terms of their production chain, a particular batch aimed for the Hong Kong market had already affixed the labels for the computer. Each computer will ensure of their list market will be more precise of a smaller quantity. So they actually reiterate that. And you can see that from the principal legislation as for how do we provide the labels are different from the energy labels. For example, the light bulb has a legal requirement actually to meet the requirement by printing the text on the boxes. It's really is about in compliance with the legislation. At this time, the EPD will be responsible for issuing the labels, and in principle, legislation had a mechanism, and this manufacturer would ask for a reasonable quantity according to their productions, and they hand it down along the value chain. This reflected consultation have reflected that the value chain we have the flexibility to flow down the production chain. There are, as for an alternative practice, would be not be feasible.
The legal advisor. Thank you, Chairman. Well, just now, I very briefly did a search in relation to the energy efficiency label CAP 598 Section 5. It provides that if the person at the time of providing the equipment, unless the person has ensured that certain conditions have been met. And for the energy efficiency label, responsibility is put on the person providing or selling the electrical equipment, and that unless he ensures that certain conditions have been met. Whereas for this bill, the principal legislation for Section 35(2), it's not expressed in such a way, and that is why I raised this issue just now. I want members to understand Mr. Hoi's amendment, because right now there is no obligation for the seller to ensure that the recycling label has properly been affixed onto the REE. If Mr. Hoi would like to impose this responsibility on the seller, then this amendment doesn't reflect this requirement. The effect is that for the supplier, he is required to affix the label, whereas for the seller, the requirement is only that he should provide the label. But we also need to refer to the requirement in Section 35(2), and that is why about provision of recycling label by the supplier and by the seller, these are separate responsibilities. Regardless of whether the supplier has provided the label, the seller at the retail level must be capable of providing a recycling label to the consumer so that the seller himself can comply with the requirement in the ordinance. This may be a fine distinction, but need to decide whether to have the word ensure. I think that we cannot depart from the objective of the bill. And next member, Mr. Junis Ho. Thank you, Chairman. I think it's quite complicated whether or not the recycling label can be given to the consumer if so requested by the consumer. But it seems that at the retail outlet, there may be goods sold claiming that the levy has been paid, but then it's actually parallel goods, and will the consumer be cheated some $100 as a result? I think Mr. Hoi's concern is whether any fraud is involved. Let's say if I'm the consumer, if the label is not provided to me, there is no way for me to trace the problem. But if I'm given the label, then I can be sure, as I can follow this up with the store, like Broadway or other stores. So I also note the concern if there is no such requirement in the principal legislation, and if you all of a sudden require the seller to do that, then it may be difficult. But let's say after collecting the recycling levy, let's say if I buy an air conditioner online, it comes with a serial number. And for the government, the recycling levy collected would be registered. Can we do something so that the consumer can check online whether the levy has been collected? Can the information be made available? Before I invite the Deputy Director to respond, I'd like to say that this is an indicative system showing that levy has been charged. So the consumer will know very clearly whether the levy has been collected. Although now there is no requirement for the label to actually be stuck onto the equipment, the requirement is that it should be provided. All right, so it should be provided. I would like to respond to Dr. Ho's comments, Chairman. The law provides that the seller must provide the recycling label to the consumer through different ways, one of which is to affix it onto the equipment, or it can be stapled with the receipt. We're taking a flexible approach, whereas Mr. Ho's amendment is more rigid, and that the label must be affixed onto the equipment. But let's say if Mr. Ho is concerned whether this label is genuine or not, there should be a way for the consumer to check with the government's register whether the recycling label is true or not. How can I verify using the government's available data whether this is genuine or not? For the recycling label, earlier we already briefed members on the format and the features of the recycling label. We understand Dr. Ho's concern. We'd like to have some counterfeit-proof features. But we have counterfeit notes, even with all the features, as to whether we need to have additional measures. Well, for example, using a false label is a breach of the law, and we also conduct inspection to check compliance. We will check suppliers and sellers on whether they are fulfilling the compliance requirements, but there is no way to verify the information. But because the REEs involved will be huge in quantity, it will be operationally difficult to achieve that. Next, Mr. Wong Ting Kwong. A few days ago, I came across a number of friends in the Golden Shopping Arcade, and we understand that there are still shops selling self-assembled computers. So will they be covered under the as an REE? And among my friends, some of them sell RAM and circuit boards. And once this bill comes into operation, how should these be handled? We talk about suppliers, distributors. These are all branded goods. What about those non-branded goods sold in Golden Shopping Arcade? When we discussed the principal legislation, we covered the definition of REEs, but perhaps I'll defer to Mr. Lai to elaborate this point. That depends on the actual operation. There are two kinds. Let's say if you go to the Golden Shopping Arcade, our discussion is about different parts, but computer parts are not covered in this regulation. For example, if you have CPU memory and the motherboard, we will not take each piece into account as a separate equipment. So it's not covered in this regulation. On the other hand, in the computer industry, there are people who would buy a case and then buy a desktop computer and choose their own hardware specification, and that's another matter. For the self-assembled computers in Golden Shopping Arcade, for the seller to provide the number of parts for the consumer to install or assemble the computer himself, then it's not covered in the REE. Next, Mr. Ted Hui. I'd like to respond to a number of points raised. Just now, members and the legal advisor referred to the energy efficiency label. I also referred to the legislation. As far as the principal legislation governing recycling label and the energy efficiency label are concerned, there are similar requirements. Like the legal advisor said, unless he ensures that the label has been stuck he cannot sell it. But in fact, in Section 35 of the principal legislation, he must provide the label, and that's a legal requirement. Of course, affixing the label and providing the label are different matters, but at least this is a responsibility of the seller. So I think that in terms of his responsibility, it is the same. It is just the way how it is provided that is different. Second point, just now the legal advisor also mentioned that in relation to my amendment, the seller will have a separate responsibility of ensuring the label has been provided. And the legal advisor asked whether the seller must unwrap the packaging or open the box, but there are many other ways other than opening the box. For example, whether an agreement can be signed or whether an inspection can be conducted at the production line. If he has taken all the steps and made every effort, you cannot say that he is liable. So I think that this separate legal responsibility should remain, and I agree. But is it that he must open the box to inspect the label? I don't think so. There are different ways administratively to ensure that. And I believe that definitely if he has taken every step to monitor the situation, it will not be a strict liability case. And third point, I'd like to remind the administration and members why we need to have the recycling label in this bill. Let's spend a few seconds to think about it. If it's already expressed in the receipt, then we can just do away with the recycling label at the outset. Now, for the principal legislation, we have the recycling label provisions because we want to inform the consumers for the purpose of public education or to allow consumers different choices or to remind consumers that it should be recycled. There is a meaning to the recycling label. And if it is meaningful and yet you don't require the label to be stuck onto the equipment, then it becomes meaningless. We need to consider the purpose of having the recycling label in the first place. I'd like the Deputy Director to respond to a point. I think he has covered this point before. Be it the principal legislation or the regulation itself, we believe that it is important to have the recycling label. Otherwise, like Mr. Hui said, we would not have proposed to have a recycling label. The difference is how we should give the label to the consumer, which we believe to be necessary, and we do allow flexibility for the supplier or seller to handle the situation, and we also need to inform the consumer the level of levy charged. We share the same view, but only on this point we don't think it's necessary that the label should definitely be stuck onto the equipment. I think the legal advisor also has some comments.
I know where Mr. Hui's concern is. However, there has been some major legal principles to be clarified. And, for example, we just try to borrow the principles of the energy-saving labels. Because actually, these labels have a line of special responsibility. It's about the duty to insure. And in this principal legislation, the reseller responsibility is the duty to provide. Is to a duty to provide as for compared to duty to insure to legal compliance. It's two different legal duty in nature. Thus, in this principal legislation, it clearly spelled out that the reseller responsibility is to provide the recycling labels. However, for the Energy Efficiency Ordinance, it stated that if the appliance seller is not the manufacturer or the importer, it had the duty to insure unless the following conditions have been met. Thus, that it could and sell the equipment to the consumers. Thus, I hope to make it clear the legal foundation for this. And Mr. Hui is incorrect that no matter what, and the principal legislation had a obligation to provide labels. It's just for the method of providing labels. The ministry intention was to have the details to put in this subsidiary legislation, under what circumstances and through what method to providing the labels. This is the legal foundation, as like Mr. Howe has said, whether there have been other methods or a strict or liabilities to energy have differences. Thus, we have to do a careful study for this. And looking at the text wording, and we just looking at, I can see two separate liability. And nobody could just point a finger that you had responsibility and I don't. Any further questions, Mr. Mock? I would like to say something, just like Mr. Hui, concern. And for the recycling label, I'd like to speak on the record. And for the computer goods and equipment affected by this regulations, it come under a special situation, and also having a different scenario with other electronic goods because the computer product are rather small. For example, the labels are kind of about the size of half a palm. So you can imagine, especially the Apple computers have no labels. So if you're affixing a label so that if it's still alive, I would say, I would not rather sell it in Hong Kong. This is as for the computers of other brands, you can see this very mini Windows label. You can see less and less these days, and you can see that you can probably the size of half a finger. You affix them, it will have a major impact on the products. I'm not sure if there are examples in other jurisdictions that require affixing the recycling labels in this computer for products. It was quite different in affixing on the bridge, and also the production chain is different from the refrigerator because this goods the consumer carry it yourself. For example, desktop computer, in a lot of circumstances for those used at home, you would carry it yourself. For example, you not have someone to remove the packaging. So there will be a lot more options on the delivery that would able to take care of the labeling issue. In contrast, one of the most ironic aspect, so it applying have the small least amount of levy on the computer goods. However, the cost of affixing them would be the highest, and along the supply chain, for the sake of affixing these labels, the cost involved will be higher than the $15. Thus, the handling would be quite different. Even have you affixed the labels, so what would happen? You have such a label on my notebook, so I would think of ways to get rid of it. I haven't even started how sticky with the labels is or whether they could be taken off. That way I haven't asked. So the way you've affixed the label, you can just only take a glance, and at the end it's about the awareness. And maybe in a few years' time or 5 years' time, you will need to dispose of the product. Would you still know how to take care of that, or they need to be recycled? This education and a build awareness will be more important than the label themselves. I hope to express this as a matter of record. Put it this way. In relation to Mr. Hui's proposed amendment, and we're upon hearing the discussion, if there is enough time to see, we can adjust the wording or for further consideration. We need to do a work that for the CSA proposed by the administrations. And on the cluster vetting, we have to do them first. So we need to do the vetting on those amendments. I know that the legal advisor have some questions, so let's start this process and listen legal advisor's opinion when it comes. In the document, I've annotated the amended content and on the method of providing the recycling labels. For example, the number 9 and section 27. Quite similar. The original text would be to avoid doubt. The label is not required to be provided by affixing it onto the registered electronic equipment. And now the new text would read, and to say that it would now read the registered supplier and may provide the label by affixing it to the regulated equipment or otherwise. And correspondingly to 27, it will be for the supplier to doing this. They should respond to the committee's opinion to directly encourage the reseller and the distributor if this possible operation-wise. Mr. Hui, because in English it's giving it or otherwise, but not trying to say by any other methods. Is it through any other methods? Or whether legally is really be optional, or there are really going to be other kind of methods. Mr. Lai, in the early discussion for the principal legislation, we shall require the registered supplier and the seller to provide them. At this time, they have a lot of ways to provide such labels, whether to be fixed on top of the electrical equipment on the box, or be placed inside a box, or to mail separately beyond the delivery. And when I read the Chinese texting, I reflect the Chinese as well, the identical English meaning. So does that otherwise means other methods? So legal advisor, can you explain on this? When we look at the final legislation, we need to examine the principal legislation that you come out from, so that we can assess on the completeness of the whole text. In the principal legislation, the supplier have the duty to provide the recycling labels. So in these circumstances, looking at the wording, we can interpret that with only referring to the method of otherwise, but not whether the labels could be provided or not. Because the Hong Kong legislation 120 if we do that, contravene with the small legislation. So we read out this, interpret this way. I can see that this is the meaning he want to bring out. So the legal advisor thinks that in terms of wording do not contravene the principal legislation. Any other comments? Mr. Lai, please continue. The second set of amendment is considering the disposal service, removal service plan, and the trade had the opinions that the number of collectors, the original we proposed there were only 3 collectors, and we now propose to allow a maximum of 5 collectors. That was stated in section 31 was really about a change of number. Section 31.1 from 5 to 3. The last time the trade also had used it, and no, regardless of the number of collectors outlined, that there could be events where the collectors would not be able to provide the removal service, and asked whether there would be flexibility for the reseller to provide such services. And on 31/1, and we say that for the removal service plan was submitted by the, besides as stated for the collector, have to have the whether it intend in the event that whether in none of the collectors specified the plan is able to willing to provide such service, and whether the seller would provide a removal service, even though the trade will hope that they will have a chance to provide service. What in consultation there have been other views that the seller responsibility is to arrange the removal service. So we ought to have this flexibility. If the seller is able to provide such services in this event, so it was able to state that in the form, and we will consider in the vetting for the 32.2. We have to insert it that, and we would provide removal service. We'll consider whether the applicant would have to properly consider the applicant to remove the applicant in accordance with the plan to properly treat it, repossess, and recycled. So when we are happy endorsement for the removal service, so we may decline such applications. Legal advisor has some questions. I would like to ask government to look at the wording issues. My focus will be on 31.1, and if it inserted the Roman we say it must indicate that in none of the collectors specified in the plan is able to, willing, and able to provide. Willing to provide the service. That would not seems to have the meaning of none. So hope the administration could consider to slightly amend it to put the focus on none of the collectors specified to the plan as being able and willing. That would already be sufficient, and would not be necessary of adding having just any comments on how to amend this? Okay, we have a draft to speak, Mr. Okay, thank you, the legal advisor, for his comments. I feel that the adding of just for the Chinese is just to explain that there'll be the meaning of having no collectors, and the current way this is just for each better syntactical flow in the Chinese, so that we don't feel there's any problem, and the amendment would not be necessary. I feel that this, where the English to English Chinese different is having an extra phrase. And English actually prevented this. Any suggestion from the legal advisor? From understanding that the legal advisor mean referring to this matter of wording, however, their colleague from DOJ, so that was our intention. If we look at the Chinese text, I would not say there's a difference with the English. I hope if we achieve the intention, the amendment would not be necessary. Any suggestion from the legal advisor? The Chinese and the English wording should be the same. Or Mr. Kwok, Mr. Mok. So hope the drafters could study that. Yes, we do understand, because the person not anyone. That means, of course, referring to collectors. You'll not be able to do that if you're not a collector. So logically, that could make sense. Of course, we'll not be looking at point 3. So besides not anyone, does that mean referring to other people besides the collector? That's what the English seems to be preferred. Of course, we can also express it in Chinese. So would that be? So maybe you can consider that.
Chairman, if I may, our view is that if you just read point number 3, the meaning is clear. You need to read in context that the collector specified in the plan. I think this phrase is important. That is to say, none of the collectors specified in the plan. We just want to make it clear. It is just a drafting style in the Chinese text. We want to make things clear, because the collector could be an individual or a business entity. Legal advisor, how about deleting the word person? Well, in fact, the collector could be a person, could be a business entity, although an individual can be a legal entity as far as the law is concerned. But I think that we can make it direct, we can express it directly that it's just the collectors and nobody else. Or is it the case that the administration wants to stipulate that as long as none of the collectors can provide and is able to provide the service, and if we can just tidy up the drafting of the Chinese text, then perhaps the administration should consider it. Thank you for your suggestion, and thank you for the legal advisor's suggestion. Or perhaps you can stipulate in the Chinese text, among the collectors specified in the plan, none of them is capable of and willing to provide a service, etc., so as to clear the ambiguity. Deputy Director, perhaps we'll go back and consider members' suggestions and see if we can amend the provision. Right, perhaps you should change the wording in the Chinese text 無一人 to 無收集者, meaning nobody, changing it from nobody to no collector. Yes? Sorry, speaker, it's not coming through. In the original regulation, it provides that it is within 3 days after the goods have been delivered, and our proposal is that within 3 days after the consumer enters into a transaction with the seller. And that's for section 40, right? In the Chinese text, the term 分發 or distribution is quite clear. In the English text, it's distribute, which means not delivery, but sale or lease, etc. So in short, it's within 3 days after the consumer enters into a sale agreement with the seller. And for distribution transaction, this phrase has appeared for the first time, and correspondingly, we're going to amend section 39 to mean that this transaction refers to the transaction of an RE between a consumer and a seller. Legal advisor. Another drafting point. Just now, we referred to section 40, and we referred to the revised 40B. Now the English text reads, within the 3 days after the consumer enters into the distribution transaction with the seller. I'd like the administration to consider the words within the 3 days. Why should the article the be added to the phrase 3 days? What is the significance, and why should it be added? Or can we just say within 3 days? Thank you, Chairman and Legal Advisor, for the question. We believe that in this context, because this is we're certain about the scenario, we believe that it is appropriate to add the article the. But similarly, in the same context, if we do away with the article the, we can express the same meaning. There is no legal significance. We just believe that as far as the grammar is concerned, it is appropriate to add the article the in this context. Mr. Ted Hui, not on this drafting point, but I'd like members to consider the following scenarios. Under the revised change, let's say, within 3 days after the consumer enters into a distribution transaction with the seller, let's say if I buy an air conditioner, the delivery will usually be made a week later, and if I forgot to mention that or request a removal service, if I only make this request to the delivery staff, then this service will not be provided. Our original plan is to make it 3 days after the goods have been delivered, but we understand members' concern on operational difficulties and whether the old equipment will be left home without being removed. That is why we have proposed this change to make it 3 days, within 3 days of the distribution transaction. But as discussed before, the majority of consumers would decide on the spot at the time of purchase whether the removal service would be required. And that's the decision-making process. It doesn't mean that the actual removal must be carried out within 3 days. Let's say you can make the request today, saying that the next week when the new equipment is delivered, you should remove the old one. We believe that the majority of sellers will remind the consumer at the time when the transaction is made whether to make this choice. I believe that after this is introduced, the seller will be very vigilant, and definitely the seller will ask the consumer whether to arrange for removal. Mr. Hui, that's exactly my concern. For smaller electrical stores, they may just forget about it after receiving payment. And also, well, let's say for the old air conditioner, after the consumer makes a new purchase, they may wish to give it away to somebody else since it's still usable, and the consumer should be able to decide at the time when the air conditioner is delivered whether to remove it or not. In a way, we are restricting the rights of a consumer. Originally, before the amendment, the consumer can still request for the old equipment to be removed by the delivery staff. So even if the seller has failed to remind the consumer can still make this request when the goods are delivered. So wouldn't the original version give a greater protection to consumers? Well, I think that this is the member's suggestion that the request be made by the consumer at the time of purchase. I think if we can cover both the scenarios, it would be better. So it's about striking a balance. Originally, we discussed the period which is within 3 days after the goods have been delivered, and then the direction of the discussion turned to not giving time to the consumer to think on this problem, and that we have struck a balance, and that it's within 3 days after the consumer enters into a transaction with the seller. And like Mr. Hui said, the consumer may decide to keep the old equipment for a while, and perhaps after using the old one for a longer time, the consumer may decide to have it removed. But although this is not covered in this legislative exercise, we have mentioned before that consumers can still request for removal, make use of removal service from other collectors to remove the equipment. Legal advisor. I have a comment not on the administration's proposed amendment. I'd like Mr. Hui to refer to the principal legislation section 42, which provides that the seller has certain legal obligations to fulfill, one of which is to arrange for removal service for the consumer and other obligations. I think that this framework is set out clearly in the principal legislation. I think this can allay Mr. Hui's concern that after passing the equipment to the consumer and receiving payment, we should also refer to Section 40 of the principal legislation. The seller must bear in mind the obligations he should fulfill. So I don't think we'll see a scenario in which the small seller may just ignore this requirement. On the contrary, the seller may be even more concerned about this. I believe that the seller would like to, discuss with the consumer as soon as possible so that arrangement can be made. I think that the amendments are reasonable, and I think that after introducing this system, the majority of sellers and consumers will arrange for removal service at the time of service. For example, when the new equipment is delivered, the old one would be removed. I think that if they can finalize this agreement as soon as possible, it would be better. I think the better way is to provide expressly in Section 40 that any time after the consumer enters into the deal with the seller until the goods are received. This will give even greater flexibility. Even before the goods are delivered, even 5 days after the purchase, the consumer can still ring the seller asking for the removal service. I think that this is reasonable, and we can give the greatest protection to consumers without affecting the seller. Well, but my take is that, like the Deputy Director said just now, the seller and the consumer should be considered, and we should also consider the seller's obligations. If the consumer doesn't make timely decision, so to speak, it may bring a lot of burden on to the seller. Deputy Director, we share the same view. We believe that clarity should be provided in the law. Certainty is necessary. For example, the seller should be sure after a certain time frame that the consumer will be making this request or not. Let's say if delivery cannot be arranged and then the time frame for request for removal service is further extended, then operationally it is not very desirable. I don't quite accept the administration's explanation, but I'll go back and think about it. Yes, if necessary, you can move an amendment on this. Legal advisor, will the administration also consider whether it is necessary to include the article within the 3 days after the consumer enters into a distribution transaction with the seller? Deputy Director, anything to add? Yes, Chairman will go back and think about it, but as mentioned just now, we do hold a different view. Well, Mr. Lai, we have other text marked in red. I think that we should follow up on these provisions. Legal advisor? Are we referring to the relevant provisions? Yes, you have proposed other relevant amendments, so I think that we should go through the clauses one by one. We were on section 39 and 40 regarding a technical definition on distribution transaction, and our arrangement is that the seller should keep a record of the request for removal service, and if no collector is available to provide a service, and if the seller provides the service himself, he is required to keep a record of this request. And that is why we have added subsection G to 41.2. And then if the actual remover was a seller, which is possible, we need to widen the scope of this technical definition, and that's the only point we wish to make. Yes, 41, a number of amendments. For example, from collection to distribution, and also there is this definition of actual remover. In the English text, you also see the corresponding amendments. Remover in section 42.
For the specified date, there are some amendments as well. Prescribed period. The chairman talk about on 40 section 1 the definition of prescribed period. As when the disposal service requests for the deadline, because we had made such amendment, thus on the record keeping for a year, so the prescribed period we have just incorporate that in originally. That upon the receipt of goods within the 3 days, the disposal service must be provided. But now that there will be change into the distribution transaction is made, so that the expire of 1 year would be amended on which the distribution transaction is made. The administration can confirm, quite simply put, on the distribution transaction is for the consumer to talk to the reseller. So we paid at the counter. That would count as a distribution transaction. Yes, your understanding is correct. Section 39. English distribution transaction means a transaction in which distributed equipment is distributed by a seller. This means, does it count from the moment of delivery? The relevant distribution transaction have to look from the principal legislation, because this is not delivery, but referring to the principal legislation for the hire purchase or the purchase that involved handing the equipment from the seller to consumer. This would need to look at the principal legislation on a definition of distribute, because it isn't clear here. Mr. Light, any other markup that we need to go through? I don't want to miss anything. Go through the rest. Anything we missed out of the English? If there are no, they have no other comments, and besides the comments we brought up earlier, the members doesn't have any other questions. Of course, Mr. Hui has some comments regarding the 3 days, so maybe you can consider that after the meeting. Mr. Xu, because there's a PAC meeting next door, so I may have missed out something. Just want to follow up on the 3 days. The department's suggested that suggests with the 3 days. I was just actually a regional department of the delivery 3 days after delivery. I mentioned just to make a balance to see for starting from the day of making a transaction and within the 3 days instead of counting from the delivery date. The reason being, once the equipment is delivered, of course, and we call them later, and then they'll involve making a double trip for the delivery trucks that would cost $200-300 to balance both sides. And now the department have set for 1 day. Mr. Hui had advocated for a longer period. I guess the public needs and the business point of view, operations should strike a balance. And after the after that would be desirable, because you knock out a small foods. For example, you buy the fridge of such a huge sizes, you probably have an idea what would happen to the old equipment. I think it's reasonable to provide 3 days, for example, afterwards, after delivery, and then you will call them up to ask them to dispose the old equipment that will be unfair to the reseller. I think Mr. Hui, from my understanding, talk about at the distribution transaction level, they could take it up at any time before the actual receipt of goods by the consumer. This is what I'm talking about. For example, if they're making a trip, so you would like to make a delivery to so your truck is my home anyway. I want to give them more time to consider to whether to use the disposal service, but not extra 3 days after the receipt of goods. But let's say from the practical point of view, it might be feasible. Because after for the moment that the new goods have been delivered to the consumer, they're still able to catch it. You propose that we reserve space in the truck to remove the old equipment. Okay, you see that. I'll say now that I would like you to remove that equipment, that would be difficult. Mr. Siu has said mentioned a balance. Because the seller has a statutory obligation, thus we would hope that it would make some timely arrangements. As a consumer, I think get whether to buy equipment big or small, and before you shop, we probably have to decide whether you would like to keep the old equipment. There's something to supplement. I agree to the chairman. Because you basically had an idea when you are going to make a purchase. From Mr. Hui's point of view, at the moment the delivery, and you let them have separate arrangements, would it be performed by the trucks making delivery, and whether there's also the issue of the space? So because when they make plane delivery, the logistic routes had to be all worked out. Otherwise, it will be quite chaotic and cause problem on the schedule, and on whether they could decide at the moment they could still be negotiable. Deputy Director, we could insist on 3 days from the transaction just to balance the society. They have to meet. That they have to be decide on the spot. Okay, this information. So if you start, as a so what delivery would have been the next day, for example, usually after a week. So the consumer will have enough time to whether to give to other people or to dispose it. So once it arrive and let them decide by then, I'm sure there will be a problem with the logistic arrangements. So now that we have finished the discussion on CSA, just like the amendment proposed by Mr. Hui, we have some good arguments, so just to get more time to consider. Because now that we'd like you to consider the legislation timetable, I think today we complete our job. For example, on what you're betting, scrutinize the government amendments. Heard we will not rule out other members and would prefer amendment on top of the CAE as impairments. And from the heard from members, I accept the amendments proposed administration. Other than the drafting issues, you could go back to consider them. The secretary had provided some information in relation about tabling into the LHCO at let's say for July the 5th, the administration just about and reporting to the House Committee would be on June 16th, on next Friday. And for the subsidiary legislation, as to making giving notice, as we consider June 12th, the other days will be deferred by a week. I would like to ask the Deputy Director, what is your goal? What's your target? We hope we could table that on the July 5th meeting. So we should have enough time for this. So we should adopt the timetable. Mr. Hui, as in relation to Section 40, I would like to know if the Deputy Director, if they would go back and consider, if they made up their mind and they would not do that, if they would consider that, that means they would have to come back to have another meeting. In consideration to Section 40, I heard from the Deputy Director the response that on balance of different views from members, the amendment would stay. I would like to amend this way that your deadline will be June 27th. And of course, after the meeting, we discussed that with the DBT, and especially for the labels. I suggest that you can study harder that. For if there are any section amendments out on Section 40, and I think that our meeting might not be necessary. If you propose someone and you can just follow this timetable, we would not need to have a meeting for that. There have been no other business. We aim for a move to notion on July, the legislation regulation on July the 5th, and the deadline for members' proposed amendments is June 27. There will be an emphasis. I declare the meeting adjourned, and thanks for members' regular discussion. Thank you.